Welcome to the review video for quiz number 4 in the book of Ezekiel. And this quiz will cover Ezekiel chapter 20 all the way to where we left off in the last lesson that we had together. And so let me tell you about what the quiz looks like, and then we'll go over some of the review questions for it. All right, the first about 11 questions are short answer questions. I think one of them might be a multiple choice question in there. All right, so about a page worth of short answer questions. Those might be a little bit more difficult. In the back part, though, we do have a matching section in which you will simply have to match. I gave you 4 different groups that were causing problems in Israel: prophets, priests, princes, and people. And I mentioned several different things that each of them had that they did, and you'll have to be able to match them, and the answers will be used more than once, all right? And I got a bonus question on there just in case you get one wrong, all right? Here are some of the things that you'll need to cover, okay? We talked about in Ezekiel chapter 20 in the section called Mercy and Consequence, that although God shows mercy, there is consequences for the sin that we did. And we mentioned in that chapter, God listed 3 different examples of sins that Israel committed. We mentioned that it was disobedience in Egypt, disobedience in the wilderness, and disobedience in the promised land. And although he had mercy in each of those, there were also consequences for the sins that they had. We mentioned the fact that God did give them mercy, and it was not because he didn't deal with them after their wicked ways or their corrupt ways, but he gave them mercy because of his name's sake. He cared about his own reputation, and he didn't want anybody to think that he had brought them in, couldn't bring them into the promised land or anything like that. And so we said that he dealt with them after his name's sake. We mentioned that in Ezekiel chapter 21, God told Ezekiel to sigh at the thought of judgment. And of course, we mentioned the fact that the man of God ought to have a broken heart for the people of God when they sin. And there ought to be an emotional side to the man of God that people can see, that he recognizes that he cares about them. We mentioned the fact that God told Ezekiel to show the defiance of the people. And we said that he told him to do 2 different things to show that defiance. One was smiting of the hands, and the other was stamping of the feet. And oftentimes preachers still use those actions today. We mentioned the fact that God told Ezekiel to make a sign at the crossroads. And one of them was an arrow pointing towards Jerusalem. The other was an arrow pointing towards Rabbath of Ammon. We mentioned the fact that when Nebuchadnezzar came to the crossroads, he used divination to determine which way to go. And of course, God took control of his divination and pointed him towards Jerusalem. Now, Rabbath later was taken over by Nebuchadnezzar, but he first went to Jerusalem. We mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 22, the chapter that deals with God seeking for a man to deliver the country, that Israel had become very worthless. And he said, I'm going to throw you in my furnace. And he said, Israel is like dross. It's like the worthless dross that comes off of gold and silver when it comes through. He didn't even call them silver. He called them the dross, the worthlessness of it. All right, we mentioned in that passage that there were 4 different groups: prophets, priests, princes, and people. And we mentioned several things under each of them. We said that the prophets were ones that worked together by conspiracy to do evil against the people. We mentioned it was the prophets that made false prophecies that caused people to go to battle, and their many widows were made as a result of that. We mentioned it was the prophets that pretended to build people's lives, but really they weren't building people's lives at all. We mentioned the priests were the ones that violated God's law. It was their job to teach the law, but instead they violated the law. The priests profaned holy things. They were the ones that were supposed to care about holy things, and yet they profaned it. It was the priests that didn't distinguish between the difference between good and bad. And it was the priests that didn't respect holy days, all priestly things. We mentioned the princes. They were the ones that shed blood like a ravening wolf. They were the ones that got dishonest gain through different things, and they also destroyed souls. We mentioned the people. The people used oppression and robbery to take advantage of other people. And we mentioned it was the people that vexed the poor, the needy, and the stranger, different groups that God very much cared about. Then we mentioned that God searching for a man to save his nation. We mentioned that man, some characteristics of that man. He was to be a man among them. He was to be a man that made up the hedge, and he was to be a man that stood in the gap before the Lord for the land. And of course, we sadly said that God didn't find any for Israel. And because he didn't find any, there was a threefold judgment that God declared on the land. He said, I will pour out my indignation, I will consume them in my wrath, and I will recompense them on their heads according to their ways. All right? We finished up. Actually, we had a couple more. We finished up with Ezekiel chapter 23 and Ezekiel chapter 24. Ezekiel chapter 23 dealt with the two sisters, Aholah and Aholibah. We mentioned Aholah is Israel. Her name means her own tabernacle. And of course, that's because Israel made her own tabernacle, literally, all right? Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, created two golden calves, one in the northern border, one on the southern border, and they did all their worshiping there. Aholibah means Judah, and that name means my tabernacle is in her. And of course, we know in the city of Jerusalem, which is part of Judah, that's where the temple was. All right. We mentioned that Israel was taken captive in 722 by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah, of course, was taken captive much later than that. We mentioned the fact that Judah was attracted to the Babylonians because of all their images, fine clothing, and King Hezekiah was an example of that, showing the ambassadors everything that he had. We mentioned, of course, the siege of Jerusalem began in the 9th year, the 10th month, and the 10th day of the month. And of course, we mentioned on that very same day was the day that Ezekiel's wife died. And of course, we mentioned he was told he wasn't allowed to mourn for his wife as really a sign that that people wouldn't be able to mourn during the funerals of their own loved ones that died during that siege. All right, that is the end of the review video. Hope you do well. Be praying for you. We'll see you on Thursday.